out. So I tried to, use this building with several pillars as an analogy to the arms control architecture, and said that in the Euro-Atlantic region, the arms control architecture, you can think of the pillars as conventional forces as one pillar, theater nuclear forces as another pillar, and strategic nuclear forces, or that level, as a third pillar. And in the so-called, let's say, golden age of arms control, for example, let's just take 1992 here. This architecture looked quite comprehensive, quite stable, quite complete. At the conventional forces level, we had the CFE treaty, the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. On the theater nuclear level, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF. And at the strategic level, the START I agreement at the time, and still the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Today's situation is quite different. In 2024, Russia had already suspended its implementation of the CFE treaty in 2007. It then withdrew from the CFE treaty in 2023. And in response to that, NATO member states also suspended their implementation of CFE in 2023. The INF treaty is of the past as well. The United States withdrew from the INF treaty in 2019 following alleged Russian treaty violations, and in the same year Russia followed suit and also withdrew from the treaty. And at the strategic level, the US had withdrawn from the ABM treaty under the George W. Bush administration in 2002. And most recently, Russia had suspended its implementation of the New START agreement in 2023. So the question is, how did we get from a stable, fairly comprehensive arms control architecture to this state where we are today, where you could argue arms control in Europe is in ruins? And for answers, I turned to Ulrich Kühn's article, The Crisis of Nuclear Arms Control, from 2022. And he points to three factors that were central to US-Russian arms control in the past, and changes of these factors have affected nuclear arms control and have led to the crisis of nuclear arms control. So the first factor is a shared willingness to shield bilateral arms control from political disruptions, including instances of non-compliance and deteriorating general bilateral relations. The second factor is US domestic support for or opposition to bilateral nuclear arms control. And the third factor is the vertical and horizontal diffusion of technologically novel defensive and offensive missile capabilities. This might sound quite bulky right now, but we'll get to that in a moment. So now we can look at the first pillar, if you will, in this arms control architecture in the Euro-Atlantic region. That is the Conventional Forces Treaty. Yes, I'm sorry, we had to skip the ABM treaty now for brevity, but we stick to the CFE treaty. It was established it was concluded in 1990, and it established alliance-wide regional and national ceilings on specific major items of military equipment, also known as treaty-limited equipment, or TLE for short. And its zone of application spared from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. And the CFE treaty prescribed reductions of armaments, and by doing so, it sought to reduce the possibility of a surprise attack. As you'll see, the CFE treaty was concluded in a time of drastic geopolitical change, and so it didn't take long until, due to a new geopolitical environment, the CFE treaty was actually obsolete. So it was signed in 1990, and soon thereafter, we had the NATO enlargement, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact. And so the treaty had to be adapted to new geopolitical realities, and this was done through the adapted CFE treaty. This new treaty or adapted treaty no more had any alliance-wide ceilings because the Warsaw Pact was gone, and instead it imposed national limits on all categories of treaty-limited equipment. The adapted CFE treaty was concluded at the Istanbul summit, and something else very important happened there as well. You have to understand that Russia at the time had troops deployed in Georgia and in Transnistria, a region in Moldova. And so at the Istanbul summit of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, Russia undertook the so-called Istanbul commitments. And these commitments were basically withdrawing all of its troops from Georgia and Transnistria in Moldova. So these were the commitments that Russia made at the Istanbul summit, and at the same time, the member states concluded the adapted CFE treaty. And soon thereafter, or just the next day, US President Clinton said that Russia currently exceeds the CFE limits in the North Caucasus. That was because of the Chechnya war that Russia was fighting there. So that precluded an entry into force of the agreements. So Russia first had to come into compliance with the limits, and then the treaty could enter into force. However, there was another problem, and that is that the Istanbul commitments made by Russia became a precondition for the ratification of the adapted CFE treaty. This happened in the US Senate already in 1997, when a Republican majority in the US Senate linked Russia's withdrawal of its troops from Georgia and Moldova to a CFE or to any ratification of an adapted CFE agreement. And then NATO took that same position. So at the NATO summit in Prague in 2002, the declaration read, "We urge swift fulfillment of the outstanding Istanbul commitments on Georgia and Moldova, which will create the conditions for allies and other states parties to move forward on ratification of the adapted CFE treaty." The problem is this never happened, and Russia never withdrew its troops completely from there and kept peacekeeping troops there. And so since 1999, the adapted CFE treaty is still awaiting its entry into force, and the decline or the crisis in the conventional arms control in Europe area went on when Russia suspended its implementation of the CFE treaty. So not the adapted CFE treaty, but the original CFE treaty, which already was obsolete at the time. And now recently, this crisis deepened when Russia withdrew from the CFE treaty in 2023, and NATO members also suspended their implementation of the CFE treaty for, as they say, for as long as necessary. By the way, if you're interested in the US domestic aspect of this linkage of this linkage between conventional arms control and Russia's Istanbul commitments, its withdrawal of its troops from Moldova and Georgia, you can read more about that in Ulrich Kühn's article from 2019. And so this is the demise of the CFE treaty is, I think, a good indication where we can see these three factors at play. So because we no longer had this shared willingness to shield bilateral arms control from political disruptions, and the disruptions posed by Russia's troops in Georgia and Moldova held up progress on arms control, and this linkage was made, and it was arms control was no longer shielded from that. And kind of hand in hand with that goes the US domestic opposition to bilateral nuclear, or to bilateral arms control, or generally to arms control, conventional arms control in this case. If we look at the second area in the arms control architecture in the Euro-Atlantic region, we can take a look at the INF Treaty. Here, the background was that the Soviet Union had deployed new intermediate range ballistic missiles, SS-20s. These were aimed at Western Europe, and Western Europeans, most vocally West Germany, demanded a response to that because they were concerned that the United States could be blackmailed or would not come to its allies' help in case of a war in Europe. And so this response took the form of the NATO dual track decision. The way there was quite delicate and quite difficult for the alliance, and also domestically in many NATO member states. But in the end, NATO agreed on this dual track decision. And the first track involved the deployment of US theater range missiles in Europe, and the second track was an offer for arms control talks with the Soviet Union. Eventually, these arms control talks led to the INF Treaty, which was signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in 1987. And the key provisions of the INF Treaty was, first of all, the elimination of all ballistic and cruise missiles with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers for the Soviet Union and Russia and the United States. The INF Treaty also prohibited the testing and deployment of all ballistic and cruise missiles with those ranges, and it established an intrusive verification regime. Here again, we can see how these three factors that are vital to US-Russian arms control were at play. So this compartmentalization of arms control, this willingness to shield arms control from political disruptions, I would say was no longer that difficult because bilateral relations improved significantly as Gorbachev pursued his glasnost and perestroika policies. Also, domestic support in the United States for the INF Treaty, which was arguably much easier for Reagan as a Republican, because usually in the United States Senate, on the Republican side, there's more opposition to arms control. They are more hawkish, and so Reagan, being a Republican, could count on the Republican side of the Senate, and so big opposition or potential opposition to the INF Treaty was already gone because Reagan was a Republican president. And another aspect is that the Soviets agreed to this uniquely intrusive inspection regime that really ensured that the treaty compliance could be verified, that made sure that the missiles could actually be counted and their disarmament could be verified. However, soon after already, there was growing criticism of the INF Treaty. In 2000, then Foreign Minister of Russia, Igor Ivanov, said that the US withdrawal, or any US withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, might raise the question of the future of the INF Treaty. So at the time, the United States pondered withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, and Ivanov already suggested that this might bring problems for the INF Treaty. John Bolton and Paula D. Sutter, who were civil servants or who were diplomats in the Bush administration, and at that time then were no longer in office, also criticized the INF Treaty and said that the US motto on the INF should be expand it or expunge it. And what they meant by that was that the INF Treaty limits and only limits US and Russian missiles, but not, for example, Chinese missiles. So the United States should seek to multilateralize the INF Treaty to also limit Chinese missiles, or just withdraw from it. That was their position. And third, there was even more criticism at the INF Treaty when the United States State Department alleged that Russia had violated the agreement by testing and later also deploying INF-type missiles. And again, here we can see that these three factors at play. Kuhn states that the first factor is a shared willingness to shield bilateral arms control from political disruptions, including instances of non-compliance. And so here, instead of shielding arms control and trying to resolve this instance of non-compliance, the Trump administration rather withdrew from the treaty. There was also no longer really domestic support for arms control, so that made it rather easy for the Trump administration to withdraw. And again, as you can see here, this quote by Trump is again about China's INF-type missiles. So here you can see how the horizontal diffusion of missiles undermines the case for arms control and has contributed to the crisis of arms control. Now we can turn to the third pillar in the arms control architecture, the strategic level. And there we will discuss the New START agreement. I'll spare you the background on that and straight turn to the key limits or the central limits established in the New START agreement. It posits that the states parties, the United States and Russia, can deploy no more than 800 or can have no more than 800 deployed or non-deployed ICBM and SLBM launchers and strategic bombers. They can deploy no more than 700 ICBM and SLBM launchers and strategic bombers. And on those delivery vehicles, they can deploy no more than 1,550 warheads. The treaty also establishes a monitoring and verification regime that includes data exchanges. So anytime there's any changes or movements or so of any of the treaty items, there's got to be notifications about that. Moreover, the verification regime is based on national technical means of verification. That means just intelligence satellites or surveillance satellites, and also on-site inspections. So inspectors will come to an ICBM site and verify that the missiles that are declared there are actually there and no more than just the missiles declared there. The duration of the New START was set for 10 years, so it entered into force in 2011 and would have expired in 2021. But there was an option of extension by 5 years. And so that's what also was taken. However, in recent years, the New START agreement also got into trouble in 2020 amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. The parties suspended inspections on the New START by consensus. And the Trump administration and the Kremlin could not agree on an extension of New START. However, once Biden got into office, he and Putin agreed on an extension of New START until 2026, and that following that in 2021, they entered consultations on a follow-on regime to New START, so after its expiration in 2026. Things turned a little sour, however, when Russia submitted these so-called draft treaties with NATO and the United States, where in late 2021, it mixed arms control issues with geopolitical demands, something aimed at NATO enlargement or deployment armaments and troops in in new NATO member states. So that already was a bad sign on the future of arms control from Russia. And of course, things got much worse in 2022 when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In response to that, the United States suspended the arms control negotiations that had begun the previous year with Russia. But the United States wanted to resume inspections under New START, which Russia rejected under, I would say, false pretenses. And then in 2023, Russia also suspended the implementation of New START. And in this situation, the United States went ahead and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that the United States has stated our willingness to engage in bilateral arms control discussions with Russia and with China without preconditions. However, that position was not mirrored by Russia, and Foreign Minister Lavrov said that we firmly link the possibility of arms control talks to the West fully renouncing its malicious course aimed at undermining Russia's security and interest. So basically what Russia is saying is no arms control talks until, as they say, the West ceases its hostile policy towards Russia. And again, in this instance, here really the lack of a shared willingness to shield arms control from political disruptions prevents consultations already. But even assuming that the two states can agree to resume such consultations, the trouble certainly does not end there. And the vertical and horizontal diffusion of offensive and defensive missile capabilities would make negotiations on a follow-on agreement extremely complex. So the United States wants to include Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons, Russian hypersonic weapons, and Russia wants to include missile defense systems. Cyber is also would be on the agenda there. And even if then you can get the two to get an agreement, it would still be extremely difficult to get the US Senate to ratify such an agreement. So also at the strategic level, we can see how these three factors had turned from benefiting the START process in the past to now preventing further progress on strategic arms control. So given that now the arms control architecture is in ruins, we can turn to the consequences and look at the political and strategic impact of the arms control crisis. First, let's turn to the political impact, and here the consequence is the erosion of the non-proliferation regime. What is often called the cornerstone of the nuclear order is the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, and this is built upon three pillars. So the first pillar is the non-proliferation pillar, that non-nuclear weapon states or states that are not recognized as a nuclear weapon state under the NPT forego nuclear weapons, and in exchange, the recognized nuclear powers have to pursue disarmament. So the Article 6 of the NPT states that each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. So this is basically a bargain between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, and that bargain also includes the third pillar, which concerns the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So the non-nuclear weapon states forgo nuclear weapons, and in return, they get the peaceful uses of nuclear energy and the prospects that the nuclear weapon states would eventually pursue disarmament. Now if we consider this, these three pillars of the non-proliferation regime, some would say that this regime is about to collapse, and it looks quite unstable. So this could be a suitable analogy. So as I said, the disarmament pillar of the NPT is under strain, and as a symptom of that, or as a sign of that, all recognized nuclear weapon states are currently modernizing or even expanding their nuclear arsenals, and there's no negotiations to halt the nuclear arms race. And this contributes even further to the higher salience of nuclear weapons in international politics. And this has further consequences. So on the one hand, some non-nuclear weapon states challenge the non-proliferation norm. We've seen this in the past with with North Korea that withdrew from the NPT. Iran is also now a nuclear threshold state. So nuclear proliferation actually seems to be the conclusion that some states take from the lack of progress on disarmament. And on the other hand, other non-nuclear weapon states seek other ways to nuclear disarmament and have concluded the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. That treaty is sort of an alternative or complement to the NPT, and it focuses on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and it seeks to delegitimize nuclear deterrence. Now we can turn to the strategic impact or the strategic consequences of the arms control crisis. And I would say first and foremost, there are increased incentives for an arms race. Here we can see calculations by Matt Corder from the Federation of American Scientists of what the United States, the upload capacity of the United States and Russia without New START. So if they wanted to exceed New START limits, just given the delivery vehicles and launch platforms they have at the moment, how much could they upload more nuclear warheads? And the United States currently under the New START rules has 1,670 warheads deployed on 665 launchers. And if it were to disregard the New START limits, it could, without any build-up or new weapon systems, it could expand the number of launchers to 715 and deploy 3,570 warheads on those launchers. It's similar for Russia. We get a similar picture. Russia cannot expand the number of launchers, but on the launchers that they have, instead of 1,674 warheads, they could deploy additional warheads on top of ICBMs or SLBMs and get to 2,629 warheads. So in summary, the United States could more than double its nuclear arsenal in terms of warheads, and Russia could expand its nuclear arsenal or its strategic nuclear arsenal in terms of warheads by 60% if they were to simply disregard the New START limits. The next problem is a reduced transparency of nuclear arsenals. As I've said, the New START treaty manages verification and monitoring through on-site inspections. Those have been suspended since 2020 through data exchange. Those have now also been suspended since last year, and through national technical means of verification. So as I said, surveillance satellites. And these surveillance satellites are now the only means of verification left, given that we no longer, that the on-site inspections and data exchanges are no longer implemented. And what's important, the strategic arms control treaties between the United States and Russia have also prohibited interference with these national technical means of verification. So you could not, for example, blind surveillance satellites from missile bases in order to make sure that they cannot see what's going on there. However, if New START treaty is no longer in force, then this would no longer be prohibited under the Nuclear START treaty, and it could further reduce transparency of nuclear arsenals and could further undermine the confidence that the other side adheres to New START's central limits. So, given this dire situation, what next? What can be possible responses to the arms control crisis? The United States and the United Kingdom and France have, at the recent review conference of the NPT, submitted a working paper where they proposed some principles and responsible practices for nuclear weapon states. So basically, responsible nuclear behavior, and that included reviews to make sure that the nuclear arsenals are fail-safe, so that they cannot go off inadvertently, for example, accidentally. That also included risk reduction measures, and for example, to make sure that humans are always in control concerning decisions, or when it comes to decisions concerning nuclear weapons in the command and control systems. So basically, this approach was geared towards establishing norms around nuclear weapons. And one thing that they could add to this label of responsible nuclear weapon states could be negative security assurances. So this basically means a pledge not to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states that has been done in the past. The Budapest Memorandum was included these security assurances, and so France, the United States, and the UK, as responsible or self-proclaimed responsible nuclear weapon states, could reissue such negative security assurances to non-nuclear weapon states in order to also, for them, reduce the salience of nuclear weapons. And so this is, for example, one proposal that Olamide Samuel recently made. When it comes to the United States, another option to avert an arms race given the arms control crisis could be a more restrained nuclear targeting policy. This may get quite technical quite soon, so if you're interested in reading more about that, I can recommend James Acton's recent piece in War on the Rocks for you. But basically, right now, the United States has a counter-force targeting policy. That means that it targets an adversary's nuclear forces, and that means also when an adversary deploys more and more nuclear forces, that means more targets, and eventually you might need more nuclear forces on your own. However, if you instead target conventional military forces and war supporting industry, you may a finite amount of nuclear forces or a steady amount of nuclear forces would be sufficient for that, even if an adversary is expanding its nuclear arsenal. So that way, Acton suggests you can maintain deterrence without an expansion of your nuclear arsenal. And last but not least, once a window of opportunity opens, and of course that's a big if, I would urge that the United States still should enter into arms control negotiations. This repeated Russian treaty violations have, of course, made this case for arms control a lot harder. And it's an easy argument to make, to say that why bother with arms control negotiations if Russia would violate the agreement anyways. But just to illustrate that indeed the nuclear arsenals of the nuclear powers have decreased significantly since the Cold War, in large part due to these strategic arms reduction treaties. And so, even if Russia violated those agreements, violated many of those agreements, to me, it's still a policy worth pursuing because simply it lowers the nuclear arsenals in the long term and makes nuclear disarmament, even if a very long-term goal, still a somewhat realistic prospect. So on that note, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Presentation. It was great, very great. There are some points very interesting. The evolution of the arms control architecture from Cold War to nowadays, the link between ABM Treaty and INF Treaty, and I think that the different possible responses to the arms control crisis, especially the negative security assurances, are relevant. I think you're right. The current US debate about targeting policy with interne or pain is a big state and very interesting. I'm going to use the famous moderator's privilege to ask the first question with the aim of letting our listeners prepare a question if they have any, and perhaps open up a little bit the debate and on another related topic. You mentioned a few times China. So how to think about arms control with China, and are there consequences for Europe? I mean, should we think about it in a tripartite way, with an agreement including the US, China, and Russia? Or does China's desire for strategic parity with Washington mean that the only solution would be to consider, as with Russia, bilateral treaties? Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah, good question. Easy question, of course. So you already gave one proposal, I think, which was a trilateral arms control agreement, and it seemed like that was certainly the policy of the Trump administration. I remember when they had talks in late 2020. They had talks with the Russians on the possible New START extension, and as a tongue-in-cheek move, the Trump administration put up flags or Chinese flags at the table at some seats that were left empty to signal, China should be here in this conversation as well. And this idea, I think in recent years, in 2019, 2020, 2021, had gathered some steam. But to me, it increasingly becomes clear that China is really not interested in arms limitations for now. And indeed, you could, or one reading you could take from the expansion of its nuclear arsenal is that it wants to achieve parity with the United States for whatever reason, or at least wants to increase its arsenal. And as that expansion goes on, a limitation would counter that policy, basically. But even more at a more basic level, China is quite intransparent about its nuclear arsenal. So just due to the arms control treaties between the United States and Russia, we know quite a lot about Russia's nuclear arsenal. They also pronounce their policy. With China, it's much more difficult. And even if you would try to negotiate an arms control agreement with China, you would want some verification measures in there to really make sure that they are, that you can verify if they comply with the treaty. And that also seems to be something that at the current moment China would not agree to. So instead, I think for now the US policy, or the West's policy on that regard, is to find other ways of engaging with China on nuclear issues, maybe confidence building measures, transparency. For example, in the P5, and all that. But for now, I would say a trilateral arms control treaty, or just any arms limitation, nuclear arms limitation treaty with China would be inconceivable or unrealistic.
Right, thank you.
Si vous avez des questions, rapprochez le micro. Bon, si vous voulez poser des questions directement.
I would have a questions too. I know that you study a lot of about the impact of emerging technologies on strategic stability and arms control in Hamburg. So I'd like to know how do you see how can new technologies impact arms control in Europe and all these treaties that are in crisis, and we have to imagine or find new solutions in the future.
Mm-hmm.
The relation between emerging technologies and arms control.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. This is, I think, one aspect that came arguably a bit short in the presentation. You know, we have these three factors that have recently, or in the past 20 years, rather undermined arms control. And one of those was technology. We talked about Chinese missiles, so the horizontal proliferation, but also the vertical proliferation, just new technologies, more potent technologies. And one aspect there that has been a hindrance to arms control, I would say, is the increasing potential of conventional precision strike missiles, precision strike weapons. So, you know, maybe ICBM silos are still invulnerable to conventional cruise missiles, but even beyond that, there's targets. We can debate how many and what share of the overall nuclear targets. There's targets that used to be invulnerable basically to conventional munitions, but now that those conventional weapons get ever more accurate, more precise, they pose a bigger threat to those targets. And then this can impact the calculus and basically the deterrence calculus. And if you have parity at nuclear arsenals or strategic arsenals, but then one side has a bunch of very potent conventional cruise missiles that might still, at least in the Russian perception, create an impression of imbalance. So that's one very interesting aspect, but that's maybe not the kind of emerging technology that you had in mind. And more recently, if you had in mind artificial intelligence, that could be something that where a lot of research was made more recently. You could imagine integrating AI-enabled tools into identifying nuclear targets into this intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities. And by introducing such tools, you could also introduce new biases or enshrine existing biases into these systems. But because the operator maybe just assumes that the algorithm already does good work and can predict your what is a target and what is not a target, for example. This could be something where you could have new pathways, let's say, of inadvertent escalation because of a misidentification of a target and so on. But there's a lot more, I think, on that end. And we, that's one side of the discussion. And my last point will be that I think emerging technologies can also be an asset for arms control. For example, when it comes to verification, there can be new tools that can, for example, identify that some item that you're inspecting under a treaty is indeed the same one it used to be a couple of months ago or so, and so for inspection verification purposes, that might also have a stabilizing role.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about arms control effectiveness in general. Do you think that this kind of ceiling that are put for the intensity of the arms really help to stabilize the world? Because since a few years, we are seeing more and more indirect warfare, whenever it's the medias or the informatics. So my question is, do you think arms control are really effective at stabilizing the world? Or for you, their sole purpose is just avoiding a nuclear war?
Okay. So let's see. I'd say historically, you know, I skipped this part in the presentation, unfortunately, but historically, according to Thomas Schelling and Morten Halperin, the purpose of arms control was to reduce the likelihood of a war, to reduce the scope of violence if war occurred, and to reduce the economic costs and political costs of preparing for war. And this has basically guided much of US policy ever since then, since the late 1960s. But of course, it's debatable if arms control fulfilled those purposes, and it's an ongoing question in the field, in the research field. And to some sense, I would say it also just comes down to what you believe about how the world works, and you know, it's maybe also to deeper beliefs about what role nuclear weapons have for international politics. So on the one hand, if you think that a stable or nuclear deterrence with mutually assured destruction, with secure second strike capabilities, keeps the peace at least between nuclear armed states and helps them to avoid a large-scale conventional war or a nuclear war, then you could say that, well, nuclear arms control, by helping to stabilize that relationship, also contributes to peace. But there's lots of problems, I would say, with that argument. For example, during the Cold War, the then Third World or the Global South, many states that were not aligned with nuclear powers, that were not under a nuclear umbrella, as we say, did not enjoy that peace, and rather the conflict was outsourced from the, let's say, the First and the Second World to the Third World. And the same goes today. I mean, Ukraine is not enjoying the peace because it's not under a nuclear umbrella. And also, you could say that nuclear weapons did not stabilize relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, for example, but they were much rather a source of conflict, of political conflict. Just think about the Euro missile crisis and the early 1980s, where relations were really, really tense. And much of that tension was about preparing for nuclear war, developing new capabilities in order to deter nuclear war. So I'd say, I'm sorry if I'm losing my thread here, or if I'm giving a very long answer to your question, but I'd say if you think that overall it's good to have a stable deterrence relationship in order to avoid nuclear war, then there's a case for arms control to be made. And arguably, you don't even have to go that far to make a case for arms control. I think it was Hadley Bull who said that to him, it's enough that I'm not sure whether it was Hadley Ball or someone else. I can look that up and let you know. But for him, it was enough that arms control would reduce the economic costs of the arms race, and so even that made it a compelling case.
I have maybe one more question. More generally about the architecture. I think it was 2 years ago. John McLean proposes a new format, a new solution. He calls whole stop, which consists of living bilateral treaties and would involve all recognized nuclear powers and aim to impose quantitative limits on nuclear weapons without completely abandoning them. Therefore, the main obligation for China, United States, United Kingdom, France would fall under transparency and monitoring measures, confidence measures, which would be at the heart of this new format, new system of whole start. Does seem relevant and overall possible to you, or are there still too many impediments to consider such a format between a P5 nuclear power? Thank you.
That was all start or full start?
All start.
Okay, and remind me again who proposed this?
John McLean.
Oh, okay, right, okay. Yeah, I mean it's. I think the appeal of that proposal is certainly its simplicity, and I agree on that point. For now, unfortunately, I don't think it's in the politically feasible. As I said before, China is not, I would say, sufficiently transparent about this, and arguably, so I don't remember exactly anymore. Did this proposal also entail verification measures, monitoring, or was it merely basically a politically binding adherence to the limits? So that's my question to you. Did
Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry.
propose verification measures for that?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat, please?
Did this proposal also entail verification measures, or was it only about assurances among the P5 that they keep to certain limits?
The paper doesn't talk about verification measures.
Okay. So yeah, I think for now the P5 have their work cut out for them, and it does not include arms limitations or arms control or anything more treaty based for now. And even though it seems quite difficult, one of the or several of the items on the P5 agenda are discussions about nuclear doctrines, which seems quite useful. And now I'm missing the term, sort of a lexicon or to agree on certain terms relating to nuclear weapons, and that for now seems to be quite difficult. So you see that the problems start very early, and I would say there's still a long way to go before you can implement such a proposal. But nonetheless, it's good to have, I think, something out there that you can aim for in the future.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. So, from Lapierre Hug, do you think new fields of war, influence, cyber, impact the efficiency of nuclear arms control? C'est la même question.
So do new fields of war specifically influence and cyber impact the efficiency of nuclear arms control? So maybe first and foremost, not nuclear arms control, but when it comes to cyber and nuclear weapons, I'd say a big concern is that countries might conduct offensive cyber operations that aim at disrupting an adversary's nuclear command and control infrastructure. And so this, to me, would raise significant risks of inadvertent escalation when a country, in a severe crisis, a country might think that its command and control system might become disrupted. And so there's a strong incentive to use nuclear weapons to deter that, or to use nuclear weapons, as long as you can still use them, because you cannot be sure that you cannot use that you can still use them. I don't know, in a couple of minutes or whenever your command and control system is disrupted. So in that regard, I would say that cyber plays a role in as far as it is an area where there's a demand for nuclear arms control. For example, in assurances that countries don't conduct offensive cyber operations to disrupt each other's command and control infrastructure. And that's something, if I'm not mistaken, that's also been picked up recently.
I would have one question too. We have seen in the past month that there's a renewed debate in Germany about nuclear weapons and their role in European security. And we know that in the past, Germany played an important role to foster arms control mechanisms. For example, during the Euro crisis, Euro missiles crisis. And I'd like to know how do you see the current debate in Germany about nuclear weapons in general in the light of the Ukrainian war? Thank you.
Yeah, very topical question. So unfortunately, I don't think this is a particularly fruitful discussion that we're having in Germany. To me, it seems like, let's say, international security, well, war deterrence has not been really on the agenda of lots of folks in the media, policymakers as well to some extent. And now we are faced, first of all, with Russia that still many in Germany believed a couple of years ago was not benign, certainly, but had legitimate security interests, and that view is now shuttered in Germany, and so there's maybe some just irritation or confusion and about very basic views in international politics. So that's one thing, how to deal with the revisionist and aggressive Russia. And at the same time, what recently triggered that debate was Donald Trump's announcement at in a convention. Not really, I mean, the fact it's also quite confusing to me that just by policymakers and the media in Germany seem to give that statement much more thought than Trump had given it. I mean, he was, I would say, concerned about his voters and wanted to rally his voters around that statement, that the United States might not come to the help of NATO allies if they don't pay 2% on defense or spend 2% of their GDP on defense. And so now Russia and aggressive Russia is on the top of everyone's minds in Germany. Nuclear weapons are more salient, and against the background of the war in Ukraine, in Germany, we are trying to get our armed forces into shape. And so this is, of course, in technical terms, it soon becomes a complex discussion where to dedicate your resources, what especially needs to get into shape, or where to put priorities. And then it almost seemed to me like nuclear weapons could be a quick fix, or this was somehow the way it was presented. Okay, if the United States were to withdraw from NATO, like hypothetically, we just have to mirror what the United States is doing now, and the one thing if you know anything about NATO is that it's a nuclear alliance, and that in the end it's the nuclear umbrella of the United States that counts. So this is more or less how I make sense of that debate in Germany. Honestly, so one part of the debate is about German nuclear proliferation, which will be quite difficult, or I'm not a technical expert there, but we've just gotten rid of our nuclear power plants, so that's one problem, obviously, and also from a strategic and political perspective, that to me it honestly seems quite unrealistic. Something else would be complementing U.S. nuclear forces, or replacing the U.S. nuclear umbrella with another umbrella. And there, I think now in Germany, the appetite is growing for consultation with France. I understand that the last time around we had that debate, and France and President Macron gave his speech about the European dimension of French nuclear deterrence. I'm sorry, that was not picked up in Germany. That offered for a consultation, but also what I hear from colleagues is that there was nothing on the table, or that France did not really offer anything. And as far as I know, those consultations are now beginning again, or are taken up now, albeit very maybe at a lower level, discreetly, because of course, if you start talking about this too much, this also arguably undermines the confidence and the credibility of the extended of the U.S. extended deterrence.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Another question in the chat from Thierry Morin. Is there a chance that the United General Assembly will vote a resolution reminding nuclear-armed countries that they are committed to reducing their arsenals in accordance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Which country could carry this kind of resolution?
Oh yeah, so I'm not sure if it comes up in the U.S. In the UN General Assembly, but the forum for that, I would say, would be the NPT Review Conference, so the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. The preparatory commission for that conference is taking place this summer in Geneva, and then the review conference, which takes place every 5 years, will take place again in 2025, if I'm not mistaken. So this is where those kind of reminders would be issued, and there are quite a couple of states where you can be sure that they will issue those reminders, but mostly states that don't have nuclear weapons themselves, and that are not in an alliance with a nuclear weapon state. So Austria is quite vocal on that. For example, Brazil is quite vocal on that. And most vocally also the countries that have signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Those are the most frustrated with the lack of disarmament between the recognized nuclear powers, and also the ones who express their frustration most vocally.
Well, thank you. I have maybe a last question in connection with your answer about European dimension of nuclear French nuclear deterrence. do you think that the current debate about Euro deterrent could be a problem for an arms control architecture? If we have a problem with, if we have an architecture between US, Russia, and Euro deterrent?
Yeah. So off the top of my head, sure, I would say that could become a problem because for now, you know, it's been a long-standing demand and I'd say frustration or just argument by Russia in arms control negotiations that they should also involve the nuclear arsenals by France and the United Kingdom. And for now, it was quite easy to dismiss those claims because really it's the much bigger, much more involved US nuclear arsenal that is in the end is involved in NATO deterrence, and since it's a much bigger arsenal, France and the UK and as well as China could also point to the US and Russia to reduce their nuclear arsenals first, and then at some point they will join arms control also. So theoretically, that could become a problem further down the road. For now, it's not a problem, first of all, because there's no arms control negotiations, and second of all, it's. I mean, you probably know this better than I do, but even a stronger role of the French nuclear arsenal in extended nuclear deterrence, to me so far seems quite unlikely. But please do correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I think I agree. Thank you very much for this answer. I think we could ending this session. Tim, one more time, thank you very much. Really, thank you very much for this great presentation. It was really relevant and interesting. Thank you for our participants for the question and the attention. Good evening, everyone, and Tim, one more time, thank you very much.
Thank you.